Hi all. In this video I'm going to discuss what I call the supernatural evidential argument for God, which is just my umbrella term for a number of arguments that seek to prove God's existence by appealing to some apparently supernatural phenomenon. This is a very broad category of arguments, but I'm going to present an argument structure that will encompass many of them so as to point out some of their common flaws. The basic way that this argument goes is that the apologist points to some phenomenon, argues that it cannot be explained naturalistically, and that God is the best explanation for it. Therefore, we are justified in believing in God. More formally, premise 1. Phenomenon X exists. Premise 2. X has no naturalistic explanation. Premise 3. The best explanation for X is God. Conclusion, therefore God exists. Depending on what the phenomenon X the apologist puts forward, this basic structure covers a number of common arguments. In fact, it probably covers the majority of arguments that apologists actually use. It covers the cosmological argument, including the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument from fine-tuning, the argument from abiogenesis, the argument from irreducible complexity, the argument from biochemical complexity, the argument from specified complexity, the argument from consciousness, the argument from morality, the argument from free will, and any other teleological argument, the argument from religious experience, the transcendental argument for God, and probably many more. Now, each of the arguments mentioned have their own unique problems that I'm not going to cover. What I do want to point out is the obstacles that are common to all of them. There are two main obstacles to this argument. The first is trying to establish that phenomenon X cannot be accounted for naturalistically. To see the depth of the issue here, consider the history of unexplained phenomena. A few thousand years ago, humanity understood very little about the universe. Since then, literally thousands or millions of phenomena have been explained, and so far, not a single one has had a supernatural explanation. Every single thing that has been explained naturalistically. Not a single one has led to a supernatural explanation. So, before knowing any of the details of phenomenon X, we should expect that if it has an explanation, it will be a naturalistic explanation. The base rate of unexplained phenomena turning out to be supernatural is easily no more than 1 in a million. This doesn't mean that supernatural phenomena can't exist, but rather that any claim that they do exist has to overcome this base rate. So, for us to conclude that phenomenon X has no naturalistic explanation, we need to establish that to at least the same odds as the base rate against it, or about 1 in a million. That is, the evidence presented needs to establish that X is not a natural phenomenon with probability of error of no more than 1 in a million. Otherwise, even if the evidence seems compelling, it's still more likely that we just haven't understood the phenomenon yet, or we are simply mistaken. To argue otherwise is to commit the base rate fallacy and misunderstand statistics. How could an apologist achieve such a level of certainty? One way would be to establish that the phenomenon must be non-naturalistic as a matter of logical necessity. That is, some aspect of the phenomenon entails its supernaturalness by definition. Unfortunately, I don't think this is actually possible, as only purely analytic knowledge can attain this level of certainty. So what else could they do? Well, we would ideally want multiple scientific studies conducted by independent teams adhering to strict methodologies and generally accepted by the community of scientific experts. That would establish that the phenomenon actually exists. To argue that it cannot be accounted for naturalistically, we would need the phenomenon itself to be, at least on the face of it, contrary to what we know about the natural world. So, things that would violate the conservation of mass or energy, as many magical acts would, or faster-than-light causation would be candidates. Even more so if such effects seem linked to thoughts or consciousness. So the best candidates for supernatural phenomena would be things like telekinesis, effective prayer, or consciousness surviving death or transcending the physical body. If such phenomena could be proven to exist with a chance of error less than 1 in a million, this would be compelling evidence for some supernatural phenomenon. Some phenomena are broader and less personal than this, such as the first cause of the universe or the complexity of life. which makes it difficult to assess whether they can be explained naturalistically or not. The bottom line here is still the same though. Such phenomena have never been shown to have a supernatural cause, and many have been shown to have a naturalistic explanation. So, the burden is on the apologist not to show that we don't currently have a good naturalistic explanation, but rather that they cannot have a naturalistic explanation. The apologist must show that a naturalistic explanation is no more probable than 1 in a million, which is incredibly hard, as something like the complexity of life or the beginning of the universe have no features that place them outside of the natural. At worst, they are simply difficult to explain naturalistically, rather than impossible. Perhaps more promising are phenomena like consciousness, morality, or logical absolutes. If it could be proven that moral absolutes exist, then this would at least argue against a purely materialistic universe. Depending on how it manifested, it could also be used to argue for some supernatural phenomenon. Again, though, the evidence would have to establish that the odds of them either not actually existing or having a naturalistic explanation would need to be no more than 1 in a million. Okay, so that's the first obstacle that any apologist needs to overcome. The second one is that the apologist also needs to establish that the phenomenon X actually establishes God, rather than any other supernatural explanation. To do this, they must at least establish that God is a more likely explanation than any other, and that God is more likely than not. That is, not only does their God need to be the most likely explanation, but also that the probability that their God is the explanation is at least 50%. Of the apologists that actually bother to try and make an argument that their God is actually the best explanation, the most common argument is that if their God exists, then you would expect to see phenomenon X. Unfortunately, this is the fallacy of affirming the consequent, and misses the point that simply accounting for the existence of X is the minimum required of an explanation, not a compelling point in its favour. That is, for something to count as an explanation for X, it obviously must, if true, cause X to occur. That's a basic requirement, not a strength. What the apologist must provide is reasons why their God not only explains X, but actually explains it better than any other supernatural explanations. In this regard, the key consideration is whether any other explanation is likely. If we take as a minimal definition of God a supernatural being of immense power, then we need to, at least, consider the possibility of X being caused by supernatural beings of non-godlike power, or by supernatural impersonal forces. Any argument that doesn't account for at least these possibilities is simply a false dichotomy. At this point, many apologists will decline to do any real analysis of supernatural causation, and prefer to discuss what they think are generic terms, such as the intelligent designer or the first cause. This is fine, as long as the apologist recognises that they have abandoned the claim that their argument actually proves the existence of their God. To refer to it as an argument for God is dishonest, as it is now, at best, an argument against naturalism. Some apologists will attempt to get around this by saying something like, "We will call the first cause of the universe God." This is dishonest, as it attempts to smuggle the connotations of God, a personal creative being of immense power, into something that has not been shown to have any of these properties. Similarly, to refer to an intelligent designer would first require the apologist to actually establish that what caused the design was actually a being, as the word designer implies. Failure to do this renders these arguments impotent for proving God's existence, although they could still be used to argue against naturalism. So, to summarise, any argument that attempts to prove the existence of God by pointing to some apparently supernatural phenomenon will need to overcome at least the following two obstacles. The apologist needs to show that, 1. The odds of this phenomenon having a naturalistic explanation are no more than 1 in a million, and 2. All other supernatural explanations are unlikely. Any failure to tackle these two issues renders the argument unsound, regardless of what the actual phenomenon is. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Until next time, see ya.